and welcome to yet another episode of Hippo Brain. Here is where we have hippo-sized conversations with people with hippo-sized brains. The next guest is extremely interesting. I met him as a colleague and in corporate life, and then when he transitioned to a public policy life, I met him in Delhi. This transition and this beauty is worth listening to. I'm sure you're going to have a whale of a time, a hippo of a time in this conversation. Rajesh, over to you.
Thank you, Jaimit. Our guest today is Akhilesh Tilotia. Akhilesh spent many years at Kotak. He was the thematic research analyst there. His first book came out in 2015, The Making of India. It was a bestseller. And then he made the transition to Delhi, as Jaimit said. 2016 to 19, he worked as OSD, that's Officer on Special Duty, to Jain, who was the Minister of State for Civil Aviation at that time. And we are here today to listen to Akhilesh's journey from the private to the public. He's also got a second book coming out shortly through the Looking Glass, and we'll also talk about that. Welcome to Hippo Brain, Akhilesh. Let's start by asking you on your journey. How did a private sector person end up in the public sector working for government?
Thank you, Rajesh. Thank you, Jaimit. Pleasure to be here on this Hippo Brain show. I do hope you find the brain hippo and the conversation interesting. So my journey has been rather unique in the move from private to public life. This was not something that was planned or intended as I was continuing down my normal corporate career path. I have been someone who has experimented with careers. After I graduated from my MBA school, I ended up as a consultant in the Boston Consulting Group. I also had a small startup of my own, which was acquired by Carvey in the financial planning wealth management space. And then I spent 6-7 years at Kotak writing thematic research, as you said, for institutional investors. So foreign investors and domestic large investors, etc., who wanted to invest in India. The job at Kotak was very fascinating because the canvas was completely wide. I could write on just about any big macro issues that were there in India and what sort of opportunities they opened up. In the many years, I must have written, I think maybe 15 or 20 long form reports and would also put out some anecdotes and some interesting data points, etc. every Friday as part of a mailer called Perspectives. And I would also host a lot of very interesting people for conversations with our investors. So what that meant was that I was almost always surrounded with new ideas, new data points, new analysis, etc. Having done it for about 5-6 years, somebody brought out the point that maybe I should consider putting all of this thing into a book because there is a reasonable amount of data that we had collected and a reasonable amount of analysis, etc. And I think I was able to put together a coherent narrative of what is happening in India across a wide variety of dimensions. And one thing led to another, and somehow Rupa, the publishers, then were convinced that this is indeed a book that they should bet on, which they did. And Mr. Kotak was kind enough to also give both the internal permissions, etc., as well as to launch it formally. Did a 45-minute discussion, sit-down discussion with me publicly on what the book was, etc. So all of that became an interesting thing in and of itself, which was not planned when I had first walked into Kotak. What that did was that gave the book some amount of publicity, some amount of salience, etc. And it ended up at a wide variety of places, including, it seems, with Mr. Sinha, who was then the Minister of State for Finance. So one of these days, I got a call from his office saying that you have been summoned to North Block. Now, for somebody in a bank to be summoned to North Block means some hell has broken loose somewhere, and I must have written something which is a slip up, or something must have happened, is the initial thought that happened. So anyways, me and my boss both packed up our luggage, etc., and ran to North Block at the first immediate opportunity. Ended up spending a good hour with him, trying to understand what is it that I was working on, what is the state of the economy, etc., etc. So general 1 hour long conversation, and that was it. So we came back rather relieved, saying that it's nothing in the North Block that we seem to have created any problems with. This must have been sometime in 2015 end, maybe September, October or something. Then nothing happened and life was cruising on as usual. Around April, May of 2016 is when I get a call again, and I was asked if I would want to work with Mr. Sinha. And that was a rather unique opportunity, because I hadn't known him other than that one meeting that I mentioned. And this was an opportunity to say that all the things that I had been writing off in the last very many years on what is happening in India at a macro level, what sort of policies could and should be there, how could investors potentially make use of these opportunities, etc. This was now potentially an opportunity to make some of those changes, be part of some of those changes, etc. So it was a very difficult choice because a private career, of course, pays reasonably well. I had been around 6-7 years, so I was reasonably well set. The CEO of the firm had released my book, so there was, of course, good enough halo within the organization, etc., etc. And I had practically not spent even a night in Delhi, even on my work tours, etc. So Delhi was completely new to me, and Delhi has its own image for people who have spent most of their lives in Calcutta and Bombay, and again, as more middle class people, there is almost never an engagement that we end up having with politicians, etc. So the family was quite stunned when I even told them about the offer to move to Delhi. So a lot of these things were playing on in our mind, etc. But it is more the entrepreneurial nature, if you will, or the thought that we can potentially, this is a unique opportunity to change something and experience something different, is when I picked up this opportunity. At least the initial conversation that I had with him was that I will come over for maybe 18 months, 24 months, etc., see how it goes, and we will treat this as maybe a sabbatical sort of a thing, and then maybe we will see what happens. One of the things that we were very clear of when I was moving away from Kotak is, especially because this move was to be in the Ministry of Finance, is that I would sever all my links with Kotak. So this would not be a break from Kotak and an ability to come back directly, because you didn't want that sort of a thing to hang over there, that, hey, somebody from a private organization has come into the Ministry of Finance. And that had its own challenges in terms of how you just leave a reasonably secure thing and go out into the unknown, and we will figure out what would happen a few years down the line whenever I decide to come back, if I decide to come back. So that's where the story was. It was completely out of the blue. Ended up in a completely new city, in a completely new environment, not used to the salams that eventually were to come, or the sort of wide opportunities that it were to open up. And of course, the most fascinating thing that happened between the time I resigned and I joined him is that he ended up moving from Ministry of Finance to Ministry of Civil Aviation. And that was a bolt from the blue. And effectively, the question became whether I want to pursue this opportunity to go into public life for the idea of seeing that I can make some changes or be part of some of the policy changes, etc., in a policy setting, or was it the Ministry of Finance that was attracting me simply because I was working in a bank? Now, that is an interesting question mark or a dilemma at that point in time, because Civil Aviation, I had at best written maybe a couple of notes on. I had some broad understanding of how the market works, but that was not something that I had spent even any meaningful amount of time on. If I went with what I had written, those 2 notes, to anybody to say that I need a job in Civil Aviation, frankly, they wouldn't even take me as a steward in a plane. So to that extent, I think the idea that I should explore the world of policy was far more dominating in my mind than the idea of saying that, hey, one needed to end up in a particular ministry. And in any case, as I think all of us know, some of these things in politics can change rather dramatically, rather quickly. And when you take on a job in politics, I think you just embrace volatility, and maybe we could talk about some of those issues. But volatility is just an inherent part of a political life, and that baptism quite literally happened even before joining. But be that as it may, I ended up there and had 3 fascinating years. So the 18-24 month window that I thought I would spend there, we voluntarily extended it, saying that, hey, let's spend more time and see to fruition some of the things that we had started to put in place in the Ministry of Civil Aviation. So yeah, rather unique. Many people have asked me if there is a pathway to becoming OSD or any such things. And I say, even if there is, mine was rather unique. So there is little to learn in that sense from that. But this is now an increasing trend. Many government agencies, many ministers, etc., end up having people who come in from the private sector or who have spent some time externally and not necessarily only in the political environment, who work with them as some sort of advisors, etc. So I think this is an interesting trend. And so that is, yeah, the journey from private to public for me.
It's interesting. And I know I've read your notes and I've been a avid consumer of whatever you said or written, etc. And I know you're fairly articulate. I think you've just about finished writing the book, and as you call it, Through the Looking Glass. So from an outsider's perspective to the big government that we all look at. And you've had your thoughts on it, and if I know right, you've broken it up into 2-3 themes that you like to speak about. If you could give us a sneak peek into the book and your thoughts around this whole government thing.
Yeah. First of all, I must say that I never knew that I could be an author, let alone an author of 2 books, before I ended up taking up a day job at Kotak, where my thing was to write. So to that extent, I think once I started writing, this has just become one thing after the other. So the second book, as you mentioned, Through the Looking Glass, is what it's titled. Hopefully comes out by the end of this year. This draws upon a lot of reflections that I've had as I spent time in a completely new territory in Delhi. And as I said, for most of us, we are reasonably disconnected from the world of policy, politics, bureaucracy, politicians, etc. And frankly, many of us would rather live in our own cocoon and live in our own world where we know that we can take care of ourselves, we will take care of our own basic needs, etc. We don't really need to rely on the government for many of these things, etc. So to that extent, ending up in a world where you see bureaucrats in action, politicians and policymakers in action, etc., was completely new. And especially for an outsider, there are many things that you observe and then you realize, hey, this makes logical sense. This is why some things happen. Sometimes they don't make any sense also, but that's a separate point. And then you bring out a completely different perspective, even when you're sitting across the table and trying to think through on some of the policy questions that may arise. In this book, hence what I've done is put out 3 separate sections, if you will, or the way at least I've looked at the way change takes place or policy making takes place is I've broken it up into 3 cast of characters, as I like to call them. One is the bureaucrats and all the pulls and pressures, etc., that they end up having and the sort of lives that they need, they end up living. Then it is the politician, sometimes reviled also, sometimes not understood, sometimes thought of as with a large bunch of negative connotations, etc., that we may end up having, but someone who represents what milieu he or she is coming in from and brings to bear what is it that a large number of constituents, and not necessarily just Lok Sabha constituents, but large number of people who then come in over to a politician with their concerns, with their ideas, etc., and how does he or she in some sense weave it into policy. And finally, I think I became far more aware about ourselves as citizens and our ability to influence some of this change, and are in some sense almost a requirement that we should be somewhat more active whenever any of these changes are beginning to take place and not be very passive or disconnected from this world. Incidentally, a lot of this lens comes in from my from effectively the theme of my first book. The first book spoke about saying that a lot of opportunities for investors come in from what I call private cost of public failures. So because public policy fails or public delivery fails, a lot of us end up having a lot of private costs. We fend for our own education, we fend for our own health, we fend for maybe even good quality road we will pay for, etc., to get access to it. So I have a framework where I say that there are 9 key things that in some sense are public goods, are something that potentially the government should be providing in some form or shape. And we can talk about the economics part of it. But the very basic are the 3 pillars of roti, kapda, makan, right? Again, if you look around for ourselves, all of us have completely weaned ourselves away from the government providing us any of these 3. Even though for a large majority of the population, roti or the PDS scheme is an important component of their lives, right? Makan, the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, etc., is an important component of life for many people. But people like you and I, in some sense, have weaned ourselves away from it. The second pillar is of Bijli Sadak Pani. Right? Again, if you think about our lives, whether we have a private sector player providing us lights into our homes, or whether it is our own personal cars as opposed to, let us say, taking on the bus or the train, etc., whether it is our water purifiers at our home because we may not want to rely just on the piped water that comes in from a municipality, etc. We are self-sufficient. So we end up doing whatever works best for us, but that is not true for a vast majority of people. For them, the Bijli Sadak Pani is still an important component that the government has to provide for, right? And then the third pillar that I talk of is Shiksha, Swasthya and Suraksha. Now, education, again, most of us have studied at private schools, private colleges, etc., etc. A lot of us, for example, at the IIM that I studied, obviously benefited a lot from the government having put in some of these institutions in place already. But largely, we are now transitioning to a lot more private education. Health, many of us just end up either at an insurance that we have at some hospitals, etc., but rarely end up going at a government place. Suraksha, which is our financial security, let us say, or even just the fact that we live in some of our gated communities, etc. There is a section of society that is now beginning to get disconnected from wherever the government comes in any of these public goods. Right? And that, when I was in Mumbai, I would always think of that as an opportunity for the investors, right? Because if you could provide people education, hey, there is a company to be made there. If you could provide them health, hey, pharma companies or hospital companies, etc., are opportunities for you. But the moment you transition into public life, you realize that there is a large section of India for which this is not even a possibility. And for them, they need to necessarily rely on the government. They may wean themselves off 1, 2, 3, 4, but to wean themselves off all 9 is not going to happen in a hurry. And that, in some sense, is what I call in this new book also the ladder of development, which is to say, can we make people self-reliant in their ability to provide themselves for many of these things, right? The government may still be a large provider because the government can offer scale. So maybe the government can set up a large number of schools, for example, or is the best place to order for roads, etc. But whether it is the government that provides it or a private sector that provides it, is the final citizen in a position to be able to get it for himself or herself without becoming dependent on the government is an important component. That is an entire economic theory of how we should think about growth and where should growth come in from and how it should be distributed, etc. But till you solve for the growth aspect of it, you really need to solve for the distribution aspect of it, because all of these 9 pillars are important, are critical components on the basis of which people will build their lives. And that is where bureaucracy comes in terms of the policy making. That is where a politician comes in terms of saying, hey, these are important components for my citizens. That is what they're clamoring for. A politician would spend 15, 17, 18 hours in a day just meeting with a wide cast of characters, right? And they are getting feedback from all sorts of places to say that this is important for us. And in a sense, if you look at the set of themes that I've been talking about, Roti Kapda Makan, Bijli Sadak Pani, Shiksha Swasthya Suraksha, all of these themes have played out over multiple decades, right? So the 70s and 80s would largely be about Roti Kapda Makan. Indeed, there was a movie by that name, right? Bijli Sadak Pani became the dominant themes in the 90s and the 2010s from a perspective of votes, if you will, or the economic narrative or the political narrative that was there. And now increasingly you are beginning to see shiksha, swasthya, suraksha, etc. And not everybody is climbing the ladder at the same time, at the same speed, but larger and larger proportions of people are ending up asking the government or expecting those to become better. That still means that you have a large mass to be pulled up from the roti kapda makan phase or the shiksha or the bijli sadak pani phase, but you have to just continuously up the game. And that is a fascinating thing that you can begin to do if you are in public policy, because the government simply has the widest canvas where some of these changes can be brought up. So yeah, these are some of the things that I explore as part of this new book, as to what is it that engages the government.
And Akhilesh, moving back to the ministry, I think one of the key things that you did there as part of the various policies was Udaan. So tell us more about how it came to be, and this whole sequence of policy making that you probably experienced firsthand. How was it from the inside?
So Rajesh, I was merely one of the members who happened to be there. But it was a fascinating thing because when we had initially come into the ministry, there was a big presentation that one of the consultants had put together, and they had a very detailed, almost, I think if I remember right, some 80 or 100 slider presentation, etc., saying that, hey, these should be the rules, this is how things should happen, this is how the licensing could work, and these are the routes that people could fly on, and this is potentially the subsidy that we could give out, etc., etc. And so there was a very detailed document that they had prepared, and I think this must have been in the first week, if not maybe, or maybe the first month of us being there. And when I say us, of course, Minister Sinha and I had practically joined in along similar timelines. And so the interesting question that the minister then asked the consultants, and which after a 2-3 hour long meeting when they had presented this 100 slider, I think just turned the meeting dramatically, is he said, so how many of you are quitting to now start the Udaan scheme? Because you've spent so much time, and as a consultant now you should know where the money is to be made in any of this, right? And there was a stunned silence in the room, because the consultants said that we are not leaving our jobs to give our lives to this scheme. And that the penny dropped at that point in time to say that, hey, this is a great scheme in which you have made all the right rules, etc. But potentially there is no economics behind it. And hence, if all the bright consultants are unwilling to make use of a big government policy that is being put out, potentially a flagship policy for the government that is being put out, and they are unwilling to bet their careers on it, there is something wrong with this policy, right? So that was just a simple way of checking whether the policy made any sense or not. And I think, and in some sense, that was just the brilliance of the question, the one pithy question, if you will, right? That led us to complete reevaluation, if you will, of how we should go about doing this thing. And again, the point that I mentioned earlier is that as a politician and also as a bureaucrat, but definitely as a politician, it is your day job to continuously get multiple feedbacks from various different sources, right? Because it is not just about an industry. The moment you think about an industry, there is an upstream impact, there is a downstream impact, there is a consumer impact, there is a regulatory impact. So there are a large number of things that you need to think about. And hence, as you frame policy, you cannot do it in vacuum of saying that, hey, I have figured all the rules and this is how things would work. You just need to ensure that you have heard everyone out. So there is one element of just hearing everyone out, which is important in and of itself. The other is that you gain a lot of insights and inputs, etc. So over the next few weeks and months, we ended up doing a lot of industry meetings, many stakeholder discussions, open houses, etc. on Udaan, trying to understand how is it that the small aircraft guys think about it? How is it that the state capitals or some of these smaller cities in states which are not connected by aviation, how do they think about it? What is it in their kitty that they can offer? What is it that internationally has happened when it comes to remote and regional aviation, as it is called? What role is it that some of the larger incumbent airlines can play in this, or is this a completely new set of things? Would you get the sort of planes, etc., that are required for this? Because you will not fill up a 180-seater trying to move from a tier 2 or a tier 3 city and bring it. how do you think about routes? Should you sit in Delhi and decide the routes, or let the routes come up more organically and then see which work or which don't work, etc. Right? So the more consultative and feedback oriented we made the policy, I think that ended up creating a kernel of an idea around which the industry engaged significantly, and they brought to bear a lot of ideas of how we should define the routes, of how we should think about allocating the subsidy that we had, and frankly, where would the money come in from? And so then we were able to then turn around with the industry to say that, hey, whatever passengers you are taking on metro routes, they will be charged a small surcharge, which ended up, I think, at about 50 rupees per ticket per passenger, which was then pulled into a kitty, which would then be distributed out to people when they would do the regional aviation, etc. And we said we will make it very, very dynamic and very, very competitive. Because if, for example, Jaimit comes up and says that he wants to connect city A and city B and is asking for, let's say, 500 rupees per passenger as subsidy, Rajesh can come in and bid against that and say, well, I understand that. I am willing to offer it at 400. That validates the fact that there was indeed a market between city A and city B, because not just one person, two people are willing to do it. And it has made it competitive because now Rajesh has mentioned a 400 rupee price point. Jaimit has an opportunity to match it if he wants to, and that just keeps the industry on its toes. The stellar success of this was that we moved from about 65 operational airports before Udaan scheme came up to, I think, 100 or 101 airports. So 35 new airports were again reinvigorated, and we were able to create some of these routes which simply did not exist. And across the world, the sheer number of city pairs that India was now beginning to connect in those, I think, 2 years that we were there when this policy was actively implemented, I think we were amongst the highest number of city pairs that were now beginning to get connected. And that has its own benefits and network economics that begin to kick out, because then if it is easy for people to move from city A to city B, that just makes it so much easier for commerce, etc., to take place. Some of the smaller and some of the larger entities also in tier 2 cities came back and told us that it is now much easier for them to recruit and hire talent, because they know that people can fly in and fly out, etc., etc. What could have been potentially 15, 20-hour bus journeys, etc., is now less than a couple of hours of flight journey. You know that it will be available. So some of those things were really interesting. And for me, the big takeaway was that whenever you think of any policy design, you just have to ensure that you have heard everyone out and you hear them with an ear to try and see what they are saying and how you can put that into policy. And that ended up making a very, very successful policy for us. It had its other spin-off benefits, because we learned about aircraft leasing, etc., and eventually started to make some policies on aircraft leasing. But those were spin-offs. The policy itself then became very, very popular. In fact, the Prime Minister referred to this policy in many of his speeches, etc., and it indeed became a flagship policy for the government.
That's extremely interesting, Akhilesh. And today, when I sit back and think through the enormity of this policy and the consultative nature that is required in public policy. Now, typically, while we were in private side, we would not even, I mean, of course, we'll talk to a few stakeholders, we'll do our research, but the enormity of the consultation that you end up doing, you try and take so many stakeholders. There is a bit of, I would have assumed that there is a private side to you, which is fast, action-oriented, demand-supply, equilibrium-oriented, and there is the public side to you, which is, I don't know, slower, more consultative, more mindful of all second-order, third-order effects. How does this come together? How do you get a private brain to public policy? Are they at odds to each other? Are they never designed to meet? Or you manage to get them to do it?
Whether I manage to get them or not, I will let posterity decide, and you decide. What I can say is that, of course, these are chalk and cheese difference, right? The chalk and cheese difference is because, as you rightly mentioned, in the private life, we effectively are solving for one stakeholder. If you are the promoter of a company, you're solving for your company. If you're an employee in a large organization, you are just solving for that organization, etc., right? So to that extent, the trade-offs are kind of very easy to make, because this will benefit me, this will not benefit me. So this is what I should do within the confines of whatever the law tells me or allows me to do. When you come to public policy, you are trying to solve for an equilibrium across different types of stakeholders. And I think one of the other things that I have learned, which is very interesting, is that when you're in public policy and you're trying to solve between multiple stakeholders, you will not be able to keep everyone happy every time. And I think that is something that one needs to recognize, that there will be segments of either society or industry or players who will now not be happy. And so what you need to do as a policymaker is to make time your friend, which is to say that I understand this ends up becoming, let's say, more favorable to airlines now, just to go back to our previous ministry. But we understand where it hurts the airports, for example, right? So we will take care of that as and when we think through some of the other policies and some of the other changes that we need to do. Or yes, we understand this favors the industry now, but we need to take care of consumers, and these are the various parameters or various dimensions in which we can take care of the consumers, etc. Right? So you are always in a finely balancing act where you're trying to manage not just multiple stakeholders today, but over a period of time, and that is hence a continuous process. So it's not an opt-in, opt-out game that you can do in the world of public policy, and which is why long careers of bureaucrats and politicians, etc., are important, because that's how these things get played out over a very long period of time. Again, from a private sector perspective, there are many things that you bring to the table, because some of these frameworks are slightly more action oriented, as you mentioned. You try and bring that element of speed, but I think it is important for you to also recognize and imbibe the fact that there is a reason why you need to be slow, and you need to think through the implications of what you will be doing, because given the wide lever and the wide canvas that a government has, any small move that you try and do there can have multiple ripple effects or after effects of what can get done. I used to see that in small little instances, and obviously some of the large instances, etc. If you permit me, I'll give you an anecdote. So we ended up in a situation where there was some sort of a natural calamity at some airport, which meant that airport was shut down. Flights couldn't go in and go out, and hence to that extent, obviously fares started to shoot up, and the local administration and the politicians also were somewhat concerned as to whether and when this links will come up. In the meanwhile, so these are natural disruptions. They happen because, there could be a snow related thing or a flood related thing or anything that can happen. Sometimes even, for example, there are man-made challenges that happen. Some agitation will take place, and hence the access to the airport is cut off, etc., etc. So these things happen. When one of these things happened, and there was worry that fares, etc., will increase, one of the airlines reached out and said that we are happy to put in a lot of capacity so that we can evacuate a lot of people from there. And they also agreed to a low price, and they said that this fixed price, we are willing to fly people away. Now, if I lay this proposition in front of you, I think the most obvious answer would be, boss, somebody is willing to step up. What is the problem? Why don't you just allow it?
Brilliant idea hai. Neki aur pooch.
Right. And that was my instinctive reaction. And I said, हाँ, बिल्कुल ये करते हैं. And then I reached out to a few of my senior bureaucratic colleagues there, etc., who said, give it time. And sometimes that you would say, why are they even thinking about it like this? And shouldn't we just simply move ahead and do stuff? Why this reticence? Why this hold back, in a sense, right? Anyways, one thing led to other, and eventually this airline was able to deploy a large amount of capacity, a reasonable amount of capacity to that airport at the low price that was there. Suddenly we realized that all the other airlines which had sold tickets at a particular price point earlier, and the natural course of business, began to see a serious amount of cancellations because this was a low price and a fixed price, etc. And then there was a massive hue and cry to say, boss, what is this? This was an unscheduled flight. This was not even expected to be. And suddenly you have broken the market. Now, what is it that you're doing? And then my bureaucrat friends told me that sometimes it is best to first sit back, think and see what the implications can be, and not just rush into first thing that you think is the most obvious and holier than thou thing to be done, because some of these things tend to have impact. And again, you don't want to be seen as having helped a particular airline put up significant amount of capacity, right? That could have its own social uses for the airline, commercial uses for the airline, etc., etc. So you also want to keep that distance away. Now, many of these things tend to solve themselves out, and which sometimes in our massive action orientation, we try to also nudge a problem to its solution where it may not be required. So that for me was in some sense, again, a way to think about when you think of timeframes of responses. Yes, it is important to be vigilant. It is important to be quick to action, but not always. Just think what happens next, and it isn't obvious that you will be able to do it. So sometimes just sit back and see.
So Akhilesh, this is a fascinating story which you've said. Now, typically when you look at it from the outside, in the private sector, when we look at things, it's always we keep saying, let markets work. The pricing mechanism essentially comes into play and things sort themselves out. And then there is also the hand of the state. So there's always this back and forth between when should the state intervene? Okay, will its state intervention make the problem worse because of the coercion that a state sort of brings in? Did your views on markets versus state, how have they evolved with those 3 years in government in Delhi?
So it's a very interesting question, and I'll make a couple of observations on this one. One is a more tactical and the other slightly more philosophical in that sense, right? So let's use again this example of saying that natural calamities happen and airports, natural or man-made calamities happen, and airports in some sense get cut off. And what that means is that while the demand continues to exist, the supply has suddenly gone away. And once that happens, obviously, as we know, the prices will shoot up, right? Because demand there, no supply, prices will shoot up. Now, there are two things that you can do as government. One is you can shoot the messenger, which is the price, and say, ki boss, nothing doing. There has been a disruption, and you will now operate only at this price point, whatever, X thousand rupees per passenger, etc., and no more and no beyond, right? Now, in the private sector, we would end up saying that, hey, you are killing the market here. There is obviously a logical other counter argument to say that, boss, these people, the people who are demanding these services, etc., are stuck now, and it has effectively become a humanitarian issue, and you cannot be price gouging at this point in time. So at any given point in time, you can make both sides of argument, and it becomes a challenging thing for the government to do. So as I said, you could do as government, you could institutionalize two things. One is you can either continue to hit on the price and say that, boss, price is the problem, and I will ensure that price do not go beyond a point. So price caps, for example, are something that many a times get articulated as a government strategy or as an idea that the government should put in place. The other thing that the governments can do, and in some sense this requires industry also to come along together, is to say that, boss, what is the fundamental problem that has taken place? The problem is that supply has gone up. Now, how do you bring supply back is the important question that you need to solve for. And that may be a slightly more longish exercise, cannot be done immediately by an order of a fiat which says that, hey, tomorrow morning the price will be this. Restoring supply could take a few days, it could take a few weeks, etc. In the meanwhile, you have to ensure that you are able to withstand and withhold the political pressure that may be put onto you, because yes, of course, there may be a crisis that may be brewing. And in one of the cases, we indeed actually did that, because again, significant agitation took place and a tourist spot got, in some sense, in a situation where planes couldn't operate, trains couldn't operate, so we couldn't evacuate people who wanted to get out of that place, etc. It took the ministry a couple of days to be able to convince some of the private guys to say that, hey, you mount flights now. And as you mount these flights, and we can agree on whether these will be free pricing, etc., etc. There also what happens is, if you are able to convince a large number of people to supply, create that supply back again, the price automatically takes care of itself, right? After the first initial burst where a lot of very excited people may transact at a very high price, eventually prices begin to settle down. as we began to do that, I think also a modicum of calm began to come in, because people said, okay, there is some supply available. It may not be available today. It will come in tomorrow, day after. If I can afford to stay back a couple of days, but let's say Jaimit can't, Jaimit can take the first flight and get out. And you just need to give the market and the situation a lot more confidence of saying that instead of shooting the messenger of price, can we begin to work on the supply? Now, that requires, as I said, the ability to withstand the pressure which is very, very immediate and urgent. And it is not obvious that every time you're able to do it, but fundamentally, are you geared towards the price killing strategy or the supply enhancing strategy in this particular case? Is also a matter of what have been the policy ideas around you? What is it that you have seen work? What is it that has been naturally acceptable in the government, right? So that is one tactical point that I would make on markets versus state, and the role of the state in just ensuring that the markets work and you don't shoot down an output of the market, which is price. The more fundamental or philosophical point that I think needs to be made is that I don't think there is a market versus state sort of an argument to be made. In effect, it is a job of the state to design the market, right? And I think, and that does not put anybody in a hierarchically superior or inferior position, but the state via its regulations is able to design who will operate, how many people can operate, what are the ways in which they will engage, how does the price mechanism work, how does the contract mechanism between them work, how does the dispute mechanism between them work. And if the state is able to design a market very well, then things automatically solve themselves out. The challenge that happens is if we are unable to design a market well, is when you begin to see some of this disequilibrium take place, etc. So I wouldn't characterize this as a market versus state, or there is a line beyond which a state comes in or a market comes in. But fundamentally, how do you design the market? If you design the market well, you will solve for it. And yes, does it require constant tinkering or learning, etc.? Yes, it does. You're on mute, Jain.
Yeah, sorry. So in many ways, no, I don't know, Akhilesh, if you realize you have explained a Keynesian and a Hayekian debate and effectively squashed it. कि Hayek चाहिए, लेकिन Keynesian भी चाहिए starting में. कि start it and then let Hayek take it over and let it all manage out over a period of time, kind of a thing. As long as you define it, I think it's extremely, extremely interesting. And you probably have given a lecture in economics while you've explained the state and the private constant tug of war and what one needs to do, action versus not action. I'm just trying to switch tacks a little bit. One of the big things, according to us laymen, is power. If you are in the government, the power high that you get and the fun of power and all the fun things that happen with it. And I remember this incident brilliantly well when I had come and stayed with you and we'd gone to your office. And when I was walking down with you to the office, I felt like I was the god or something. And everybody's like, China Dhanke, yes sir. And I went with you. I saw your office and that also was an amazing experience. And when I quietly went out and of course you didn't need to escort me out, and I went out, I was some piece of nobody, and I walked out, and I'm telling you what I felt in 5 minutes in and out. You're facing it 3 years in, and now you're out. How does it work? And can you give us some tidbits around it?
So yeah, no, that is fascinating. Delhi is and power in general can really get to you. For the first few days, again, coming from a world where anybody in a khaki vardi is someone that you engage very, very gingerly with, if I may. As you walk in, somebody in khaki vardi is giving you a salute is something that you're completely unused to, right? And it takes time for it to settle down and for you to become somewhat used to it. I could almost never get used to it, that somebody in security force is actually saluting. It is just quite a different sort of a high. But power, whether in private life or in public life, etc., comes with its own small and large little challenges, etc. Somebody keeps the door open for you, somebody escorts you in, this, that, and the other. I think to some extent, Bombay and especially in a startup world, etc., we have become a lot more egalitarian. So, right, so some of these things don't happen. These are also some of the remnants of a past where this is how you show deference. This is how you show the importance of any person in any organization, etc., as to where that person is sitting, who is addressing whom in what manner, what sort of paraphernalia that you have in office, etc., etc. How many people stand up when you come in, etc. So all of these are things that you begin to see, because these are also accompaniments of how you define power. Otherwise, everybody is a normal human being out there, right? So sometimes, yes, it can get to you, and when you come out of it, you may feel somewhat, quite literally, out of power. I think, thankfully, I did not get used to it much. And to that extent, that transition was not that difficult. But I think what it brought to my mind was a massive, massive appreciation for the democracy that India is. And the fact that every few years, because of a ballot, people can be voted in or completely voted out. And for the last 70 years, we have had change of powers which have just been routine. Okay, so I have lost out. I accept the verdict of the people. I move on. And a completely new set of people will come in who may believe in what I believe, may not believe in my policies, my prognosis, my way in which the society should run, etc., etc. And people have moved in and moved out. And that has happened not only at the central level, but at all the 25, 27, 29 states, etc., that we have had over the last very many years, multiple times. So like hundreds of times power has changed hands. So frankly, what I went through is nothing in the scheme of things, in a small cog in the wheel. But the fundamental point about how deeply rooted our democracy has been over the last many, many years since independence, and the fact that we are able to exchange power also should humble us to the fact that in most cases, when politicians come into public life, they actually come in to serve. And that for me is again a big realization, because again, as I said, when we think of politicians, we end up thinking in not the most positive of ways. But just imagine, from a position where you are so much feted, you can suddenly be told tomorrow morning, okay, sir, your services are no longer required. Please move on. And they live that life. And that volatility is the inherent mantra of politics, right? Someone made a very interesting point. If I remember right, I think it was Venkaiah Naidu ji writing obituary for Atal Bihari Vajpayee ji, where he said that in his 50 years of his life, public life, he was in power for only 6. And so what needs to motivate you if you are in public life is not to say that in those 50, I will try to maximize the number of years that I will be in power. You may not end up being in power at all. You are doing it because you want to do, and you believe in a certain set of things, and you just do it. It is incidental that the power also gives you a few of these perks and benefits, etc. That's great. You may never come to them. So, yeah.
Are you going to miss the flowers on your desk?
Yes, I did not realize that the number of flower pots that you have in your room is indeed a marker of how senior you are. I was later told, after I had told my office staff to get the flowers removed from my room, that somebody told me that this is in some sense a faux pas that I had done, because now people will not know how senior I am. But such is life. You learn some of these things.
So, Akhilesh, I think one dynamic which would be good to probe a little bit into, and I'm sure it's there in your new book, is really that between the politician and the bureaucrat. You know, for people outside, and what we hear, at least when you see policy making, the sort of stereotypical thing is that the politician really wants to try and bring about change, while the bureaucrat, because of the history of India, the sort of status quoism which is there. How did you see this dynamic? And you managed to get a lot of policy changes done in your 3 years. So how did this dynamic play out between the politician and the bureaucrats?
So that's an interesting question. And I think if you think about just the nomenclature of it, the politician is obviously called the political executive, but the bureaucracy is also called the permanent executive. Right? So bureaucrat has to survive over a 30, 40-year career in which a lot of these political twists and turns will happen, changes will happen, etc., etc. Right? So bureaucrat by definition is naturally a lot more cautious person. He has not embraced the volatility of a political life that we just discussed, right? So he has made his career choice to say that, boss, I am a bureaucrat. I have agreed to serve the country, the people, etc. over a 30, 40-year life. I obviously need to also take into account all the traditions, the precedents, the jurisprudence, etc., that have happened, while also serving whatever the political masters of the day expect me to serve, as long as they are within the remit of whatever is permissible, etc. Right? So to that extent, when a bureaucracy comes to the table, they are thinking much more longer term than the immediate need that a politician will express, right? Now, as I said, there are two forces at play. When a politician is buffeted by a large amount of inputs that are coming in from a large number of stakeholders, he or she in some sense becomes the mouthpiece of what is required right now. And so to that extent, the mouthpiece will obviously amplify that, hey, these are the 5 changes that are required, and let's try and move towards that. And again, as some of those examples that I mentioned earlier, there is a natural caution that a bureaucracy brings to the table to say that, okay, let's figure out what it means for other stakeholders. Let's figure out what it means, not just in today's time, but also in the future, etc. And that is where I think we have a decent bunch of interactions and process rituals that are put in place whenever new policies, etc., come into place, whether it is of engagement, whether it is of discussion, whether it is of changes, etc., that take place in policy. And so it is in some sense a good system where the compromise between the immediate and the urgent that the politician may bring to the table and the longer term nature that a bureaucracy may naturally want to keep in mind is reasonably brought to bear. Now, can you be frustrated by some of the yes minister type of things that can happen because there are either bureaucratic stratagems or political stratagems, etc.? Of course, that can happen, but fundamentally, more or less, does the way in which the rules and the precedents and the jurisprudence, etc., help protect from the immediate urgency of some action that you may be thinking that is very, very important and critical and needs to be taken right now? I think there is a reasonable mix, and which is where I think it becomes very important for us as citizens. And we are in some sense the third pillar of this entire change, right? Bureaucracy will have its own, as I said, ways in which they are bound by the rule book, etc., etc. The politician has a large number of constituency that he is trying to solve for. And for us to necessarily have our own points of view out there in the public domain and say that this is indeed important and these are the reasons, etc., why this is important, is an equally important pillar in the overall change process. So we should not just leave it in some sense to politicians and bureaucrats to figure things out. We need to necessarily have our own point of view out there in the public domain saying why this is important. And everybody needs to say it, because I will obviously say it only from my perspective. Somebody else may have a different perspective. And that vibrant society is what will move the government and the business and the bureaucracy forward. So in some sense, we shouldn't just leave it to them. Yes, it is their day job as policymakers for them to think about some of these things, but I think it is also our responsibility to be engaged citizens, and they both play their role. And I will make one other element that I will add to. If in my speech it came out that the politician is almost always short-termist, that's not necessarily the case. They are also trying to bring about a large amount of change because they are seeing what is the change and what is the need coming in from the people. So it's not just short-termism, but they bring a significant urgency to the table because they hear it on a day in and a day out basis. A bureaucracy can also do it, is typically a lot more insulated because it doesn't necessarily need to go out to people on a more regular basis to get elected in a sense, right? So politician brings out the immediacy of the thing. It's not necessarily that he or she is short-term oriented. It's just the immediacy is a lot more that you hear from a politician than you hear from a bureaucrat.
I think it's very interesting what you're saying. And if I can summarize it, Akhilesh, what you're saying is, if you want to bring about change in India, I think if people express that, so if the demand comes from the people, that gets channelized through the politician, who will then articulates the need for the change to the bureaucrat, who of course has a longer term horizon, longer term view, looks at the past, looks at the future, but the need sort of gets articulated and channelized through the politician to the bureaucrat, and then it's the sort of give and take between the two to help bring about the change.
Perfect. Exactly. That's broadly how it works, and which is where, if I reflect back on my previous work of saying private cost of public failure, where we are willing to become apathetic and say, okay, if the government is unable to provide, I will provide for myself. We become disconnected. And I think, and especially if you think about it purely from a class perspective, it is the so-called richer class, the elite class, that has the ability to secede away from the government almost practically. And that is not helpful for a society as a whole. So it is almost a bounden duty to be continuously engaged. And I think that is the important point that has been my learning in Delhi, that we cannot just say that, hey, the state of the local bus system does not matter to me. It does matter to me because that has its own implications. Now, you may engage at a level of the bus system in a city, or you may engage at a macroeconomic fiscal deficit level. That is to individuals' choices and individuals' abilities, etc. But you can't escape away from this discussion.
That's extremely interesting what you're saying. And just one last thing before we try and close this out is, you were with a politician who's not a politician. He's McKinsey and extremely erudite and extremely corporate in that sense. You can skip this question, but any interesting anecdotes of how a person like him, and the reason I'm asking is, if people like us want to get any interesting anecdotes around how does a person like him fit into a place like that?
I am tempted to take the easy way out that you mentioned. But let me give you one interesting example, and especially coming in from his consulting days, etc. One of the things that became a permanent feature in the Ministry of Civil Aviation were whiteboards in multiple conference rooms, because the idea that we will have to thrash out any policy has to be written down, has to be put in relevant blocks of thinking and put in effectively a PPT format, is something that came very naturally to Minister Sinha. And so almost all the conference rooms started to have a whiteboard where he would himself get up and write some of these pieces down as he was hearing either from, let's say, the industry or the bureaucrats in the room, etc., etc. And then we'd begin to piece together what are the key elements. I thought that that in some sense was not the natural way in which policy rooms are designed, because we actually found it very difficult where to put the whiteboards in, because there simply was never designed to be whiteboards. But over, I think, a period of time, things settled down and we reached a normal equilibrium where the whiteboard also found its place in the history and the bureaucracy of India.
A nice one, Akhilesh. If I ask you one sort of final question, how did the 3 years, or when you look back, how have those 3 years in government in Delhi changed you as a person?
So many of these aspects we have discussed. What it has done to me is it has made me aware of this multi-stakeholder world. As I said, in a private life, that is something that you simply don't need to worry about as much. You do, but not as much. This has become a lot more clearer in my mind. I think I've become a lot more patient also, and we discussed some of the examples as to why one should be. And I think I also have a bigger appreciation of the fact that the link between a politician trying to make a policy is a long drawn affair built with a large number of changes and compromises that you need to do on the way. So just having a bright idea and saying, hey, this is how I can change the world, it doesn't cut it. It will not go far, because you have to socialize that idea. You have to ensure that people buy in. It has to stand the test of time. So to that extent, whether it is both the patience and in some sense the persistence of being there to get things done is a very, very important component. This is not a quick fix game. Any changes that you want to get done. So yeah, those have been some of the changes and some appreciation that I have had for policy making.
It's brilliant, Akhilesh. We come to our time, and I think I have a few takeaways. One is the scarcity of abundance, the private cost of public failure. It is seriously a very, very important concept. Roti, kapda, makan, bijli, sadak, pani, shiksha, suraksha, and swasthya. Oh my God, I am not going to ever win any election if I can't even say that in a line. And make time your friend. I think it's extremely useful to understand how a larger government is able to manage all of this. And it is a lesson in economics. It is a lesson in public policy. It is a lesson that you carry on when you are the secretary of your building. It is the same thing. At the end of the day, the government is just a massiveness of that same micro ecosystem. And I think these are the lessons that I'm going to take away. I think it's been an absolute pleasure. And I know one thing. If I ever walk into a government office and I know there is a whiteboard, I know who was there. Rajesh, any last points from you?
I think for me, the big takeaway really is that we need more people like Akhilesh to spend time in government. I think the richness of Akhilesh's experiences sort of added great value. And I think there's a lot of talk of, laterals in government. And I think it will help both sides, people like from the markets, people like us, from the entrepreneur world. If they get an opportunity, they can bring their sort of free thinking because India needs a lot of changes in the years to come. And I think Akhilesh sort of started it in some ways, and hopefully we'll see a lot more Akhileshes in government in the coming years. And this Hippo Brain episode should work as a great inspiration for all of them.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot for Akhilesh. Thanks a lot for being with us. Thank you for listening. This has been an absolutely great episode of Hippo Brain. It is extremely interesting. We started off Hippo Brain trying to get just people with hippo-sized brains, and this is a perfect example how a crazy hippo-sized brain who's been in the government and has come back and is sharing his experience. It gives you a better perspective. I strongly urge you. This is what I have learned in whatever hosting I've done at Hippo Brain. Like any good book, read it twice. Like any good podcast, hear it twice. The first time you get it, the second time you really understand it. And thanks a lot for being with us, Akhilesh.
Thank you.
And thank you for being a great audience.